Hello and welcome to Bristol Ideas. I'm Andrew Kelly and I'm hosting today's event. We're discussing the rise and fall of neoliberalism with Gary Gerstle. Gary Gerstle is Paul Mellon Professor of American History Emeritus and Paul Mellon Director of Research at the University of Cambridge. He's the author and editor of more than 10 books, including 2 prize winners, American Crucible and Liberty and Coercion. He's a Guardian columnist and has also written for The Atlantic Monthly, The New Statesman, Dissent, The Nation, among many others. And he frequently appears on BBC Radio 4, ITV4 and NPR. His latest book is The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, America and the World in the Free Market Era. Financial Times said, it's rare that one can use the term instant classic in a book review, but Gary Gerstle's latest economic history warrants the praise. Gary, congratulations on the book, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Can we start by defining what makes a political order?
Yes. So much political history in America is oriented to election cycles, 2, 4, and for senators, 6 years. We have another election coming up in 2022, enormous amount of attention focused on it. We have another election coming up in 2024, a third one in 2026. And the media and a lot of history books understandably focus a lot on those cycles because they give us presidents, determine the makeup of Congress. But not all political developments can be understood in such short cycles. And the concept of political order is meant to throw into our study of the 20th century in America, an idea that certain kinds of politics have longer gestation periods. They last for longer periods of time. And if they can develop enough support over a long enough period of time, if they consistently return presidents from a particular party to office, if Congress is controlled for a particular point in time, for multiple occasions, then politics ventures into the territory of a political order, a set of constituencies, leaders, policies, ideologies, so consistently deployed that they begin to structure American politics over long periods of time. And in my book, I study 2 political orders, one, the New Deal order that emerged in the 1930s and 40s under FDR and the Democratic Party and fell apart in the late 60s and 70s. And then the neoliberal order, which emerged in the 1970s and 80s, triumphed in the 1990s and first decade of the 21st century. And now we're seeing that in the process of falling apart. And so the use of the term political order is meant to help us understand those longer swings in American politics. And one of my crucial tests for whether a political order has actually succeeded or not, it's not just an aspiration, it has to demonstrate capability, it has to demonstrate an ability to dominate the political landscape. One of my tests is whether the dominant party, even when it's out of office, can compel the opposition party to play by its terms. And thus, I think in studying the past, the moment of real triumph for the New Deal order was not in the 30s and 40s when Democratic presidents were in power, but in 1952 when the first Republican president in 20 years was elected, Dwight D. Eisenhower. And the big question was, would he dismantle the New Deal and return America to traditional form of Republican politics? Or would he acquiesce to the core ideological principles of the New Deal? He did the latter, which to me suggested the power of the policies, institutions, constituencies developed under the New Deal, warranting the name order. And in the 1990s, the critical test of the neoliberal order is when Ronald Reagan is the architect in the 1980s, and then Clinton comes into office in 1993. The question was, would he roll back Reagan's policies or would he acquiesce to them? And again, he follows the latter path. I call him the Democratic Eisenhower in my book because he secured the Democratic Party's acquiescence to the neoliberal order. So getting an opposition party to play on on a pitch that has been structured by the architect of that order, for me, is the crucial test of whether there is, in fact, a political order and not simply political competition. A similar development in Britain, although I don't know British politics well enough to say that political orders existed here or there. But as Clinton was acquiescing to Reagan's policies, there are many people who think that Tony Blair accepted a fair number of the reforms that Margaret Thatcher put into place. So there are some interesting parallels between what is going on in Britain and what is going on in the United States.
Yeah, and just looking at another period of British history, just to set this in context, would you say that the post-Second World War period and the creation of the welfare state and the acceptance of much of that by the Conservative then opposition, and then when they were in power in the 1950s and into the 1960s, was that an equivalent political order to the New Deal, would you say?
I think one can see it in those terms for a similar reason. Labour Party comes into power in the 1940s, and the halcyon days of its welfare legislation really transformed the British state and the conditions of life for so many British people. And yes, what makes Margaret Thatcher so striking is that she wants to rip up that acquiescence in that agreement and return the Conservative Party to a 19th century laissez-faire classical liberal orientation where every individual is responsible for him or herself. So I think one could see it in those terms. And also, I think there are interesting ways in which the politics of America and Britain track each other pretty closely in these ways over the last 70 or 80 years.
I want to come back to the various presidents who were in power during the period you're writing about in terms of neoliberalism, but just talking a little bit more about the New Deal. I mean, that was almost a 40-year period of time, and you talked then about how, particularly when Eisenhower came in as the first Republican president during that period, how he accepted the New Deal settlement, but also it went much wider than that, didn't it? You talk in the book about the very famous Treaty of Detroit, which saw capital and labor coming to an agreement on how they were going to operate in the future in the car industry.
Yes, central to the New Deal order was a part of it was about building a welfare state, but another more generous than the United States had ever had in peacetime. But another part of it was arranging a truce, or what I call a grand compromise between capital and labor. The organized labor trade unions were strongest in the United States in the years of the New Deal order. The presence of organized labor prior to the 1930s was minimal, and then by the 1940s, 35% of the industrial workforce are organized into unions, and have been a very conflictual, bitter history of industrial relations in America. Unions might be weak, but they were ready to fight, and industrialists were often unwilling to make any compromises with them. And part of what comes out of the New Deal is an era of industrial peace in which industrialists agreed to concede more to unions and the working class than they had ever been willing to do before, in terms of recognizing unions, allowing them to bargain collectively with employers, supporting federal legislation over minimum salaries, wages, maximum hours, safety at the workplace, all sorts of things that had not been permissible in American politics now become central to it. And the most important union is the United Auto Workers, and America's most important industry at the time was automobile manufacture. So the Treaty of Detroit refers to automobile manufacturers making peace with the auto workers after having fought tooth and nail against the auto workers throughout the 1930s. And that compromise, which requires employers to take less of a profit and redistribute more of that profit to their workers, has the effect of elevating a big portion of the American working class into middle class living standards and narrows the inequality between rich and poor to an impressive degree. The greatest egalitarian moment in American life economically as the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and it rests on the grand compromise that the New Deal is arranged between capital and labor. If you ask why is capital willing to make these concessions, whereas it had not been before, part of the answer has to do with the severity of the Great Depression in the 1930s, a depression so severe that almost everyone began to think that capitalism was not working. This was not just the left saying this, this was people in the center and the right making this argument. And I also argue that the fear of communism, both internal to the United States and external in the battle that developed during the Cold War, compelled Republicans, moderate Democrats, many other Americans to support things they otherwise might not have supported so as to avert the worst being a communist triumph, either in a good part of the globe or in the United States itself. And the fear of communism and the fear of totalitarianism and a despotic regime establishing itself that could never then be overturned. So the theory of totalitarianism becomes a crucial ingredient in terms of inclining employers to make the sorts of concessions that they had not been willing to make before.
Now, there was a strong reaction to the New Deal consensus, which increased in its strength over the years. We're interested in what underpins change, political change, when it happens. And as I was reading your book, you saw this almost decade-long battle of ideas being developed, through think tanks, through journalists, through writers like Hayek and Friedman, the rejection of Keynesianism, the rejection of what they feared was socialism in the New Deal, newspapers, others. What underpinned the change that happened, all the work that took place, and the development of neoliberalism as an idea?
Well, the Hayeks, the Friedmans of the world, you were right to note that they loathed everything that the New Deal was doing. They didn't see that as saving America from communism. They thought that was propelling America on the road toward state socialism or something worse, ruining liberty, enterprise, self-reliance, ruining everything that America stood for. And they were vociferous in their criticisms, but they were also utterly irrelevant in American politics in the 1950s and 60s. And this is a lesson to the left today, because these neoliberals who were utterly irrelevant in the 1950s and 60s would ultimately triumph, but not for 25 to 30 years after they took their stands. And neoliberals coalesced and established a network on an isolated mountaintop in Switzerland, Mount Pelerin. They called their society the Mount Pelerin Society. And I've always been intrigued by why would they go to such an isolated place to work out their ideas and establish their networks. And I think the answer is quite simple and straightforward. They were isolated and inconsequential. It didn't really matter where they met. No one was waiting outside the doors, whether it was in New York, London, or Mount Pelerin, to catch the latest word from the Mount Pelerin Society. So it's not like the Tory party today or the CPAC, the conservative group in America that's just holding its convention. Media is all over the place there. There was no interest in the Mount Pelerin Society. So these individuals in these networks worked hard in solitude for decades, refining their ideas, really undertaking what people on the left in other circumstances would call a long march through the institutions, through media, carefully building their case. But even with all their careful work, their ability, the opening that they got was in a sense out of their control. It happened because of basic changes in the global economy in the 1960s and 70s, changes in the global economy that made affluence in America harder to achieve, and that made the formulas of the Keynesian policymakers who were at the center of the New Deal order, it made them look foolish because they could no longer predict accurately what the economy was going to do. And we can talk a little bit more about the seismic economic changes of the 1970s. And but these seismic economic changes then put stresses on divisions within a political order. A political order is cumbersome. It has to include a lot of different constituencies, interests. It has to assemble them into a cohesive whole. There are always points of fracture, always points of tension. And in the New Deal order, the most important point of tension was on race. The New Deal, the progressive politics of the New Deal would not have passed but for the support of white supremacist Democratic senators in the South. And they said, we will go along with your progressive policies nationally as long as you respect, you meaning Washington, respect the racial and class hierarchies that exist in the American South. That meant respecting Jim Crow, apartheid, keeping blacks under white heels, and how long could the New Deal order proclaim its commitment to equality and inclusiveness if these situations presented themselves? And so the race issue was marginalized in the 1930s, but could only be marginalized for so long. And in the 1960s, the civil rights movement breaks out with force in America, and that forces different parts of the New Deal coalition to take stands on what they imagine the racial future of America will be. Will it become a nation of full equality, or will American apartheid survive? And this drives a deep wedge into the Democratic Party that it still arguably has not recovered from it, and ends up costing them the support of the white South, as the Democratic Party rightfully supports the campaign for civil rights. So this begins to fracture the Democratic Party in a time of prosperity. And then the changes in the world economy in the 1970s make the economic promises of the New Deal order look vacuous. There are two major changes that occur. One, America had been supreme in the world industrially. It was the only economic power left in the world after 1945, with industrial capacity and the ability to deliver. Most of the rivals to the United States had seen their economies destroyed by war. Much of Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Belgium, Italy, they were rebuilding. America was helping them to rebuild. And in the 1960s and 70s, they become serious competitors of the United States once again. So America no longer has the global power it had for 30 years unchallenged. And the other big change is the revolt of the global South against the global North. The global economy that America was building rested on cheap energy, and cheap energy rested on the ability of Anglo-American oil companies to control the flow and pricing of oil out of the Middle East. And that changes radically in the 1970s as the oil producing nations led by Saudi Arabia organize themselves and say, listen, guys, this oil belongs to us. We're going to determine the pace of its extraction and the price at which we will sell this to you. And suddenly the cheap energy economies of the global North are thrust into crisis. So the racial issue in combination with these profound changes in the global economy cracks the New Deal order wide open and gives these long, lonely neoliberals a chance to make their case. And they find a politician, Ronald Reagan, governor of California, who had been studying their ideas for decades. So there's an opinion that Reagan wasn't very smart, that he never read a book, that he didn't really know what he was doing. His puppeteers would wheel him out and tell him to say certain things. He mixed up facts and fiction all the time. He had a good smile, but nothing else. Well, that's the wrong understanding of Reagan. He, in his own way, was a very sophisticated and deep thinking politician and was deeply committed to neoliberal ideas, which meant most of all freeing the market from all constraints, destroying the regulatory state as far as much as it was possible to do. And that gives the neoliberals a chance to triumph.
One thing I want to come back to at the end is that long march through the institutions and what it means for the left. It struck me very much as I was reading your book the sheer effort that these people put in, often, as you say, in a framework of almost loneliness and lack of impact for many years, but kept going at it time after time. And I'll return to that at the end. Just before we come on to Reagan, could you tell us about what neoliberalism is? I know it encompasses many things, but there are some key points, aren't there, that are shared widely?
Yes, you bring 3 or 4 people together in a room and they'll each give you a different definition of neoliberalism. My working definition is this, and the one I use in the book. It's a creed that wants to unleash capitalism's power and to free markets from constraints. The doctrine, or neoliberals who advocate this doctrine, believe that markets left to their own devices can produce the greatest economic growth and thus the greatest economic good. It's a creed that prizes the free movement of capital, goods, information, and people across borders with few or no constraints. It aspires to globalize capitalism and deregulate economies. It prizes innovation and disruption. And one of the reasons I choose to call these people neoliberals rather than a more common name in the United States, which is conservatives, is that conservatives in a classical sense don't prize innovation and disruption. They prize respect for order, hierarchy, tradition. Some who subscribe to the neoliberal creed also value the hybridization of cultures that comes from crossing borders. And cosmopolitanism is a word I attach to the celebration of different races, nationalities, and ethnicities mixing with each other. Cosmopolitanism is often associated with the left, but in my book, I argue many neoliberals are perfectly comfortable with the celebration of ethnic and racial differences and encouraging hybridization. And just as they encourage the flow of capital across borders, they encourage the flow of people. And of course, people always have cultures in tow. Another aspect of neoliberalism that matters to some is the idea that just about anything that humans do can be understood in market terms. So it's not just you and me exchanging goods. You want to buy a baseball card from me, I want to buy a football card from you, and we agree on a price and we exchange, and we don't want to be bothered by government regulating our exchange with each other. Some neoliberals began to think that all kinds of activities that humans engage in, not just traditional commerce, but family formation, schooling, sport, can be improved if a kind of economic calculation is applied to those activities. So there's also, as part of neoliberalism, an effort to universalize economistic thinking. And in my own view, and the view of many others, that has had a very deleterious effect on human relationships. And I think the classical liberals of Adam Smith's era in the 18th and early 19th century, and also for a good part of the Victorian era, had a better idea. They understood that liberalism ought to be freed for the exchange of goods and free movement of commerce, but that there were areas that should not be marketized. And one of those was the family. Another of those was school and education. That there were elements of humanity that had to be separated from market. Love, virtue, the other sentiments. Not everything that we do as human beings can be marketized. And you see in elements of the neoliberal order an effort to economize everything, and that has also become a very important part of the neoliberal order, and will likely survive the collapse of the neoliberal order, because this is what we might call a form of neoliberal reason. And even if an order collapses, residues and elements of that order will persist for long periods of time.
So you had all this work and you had all these ideas, and then people began to get into power who could implement some of these things. And the first one you talk about in detail in the book is Ronald Reagan. And where did Carter come into this, by the way? He was just prior to the, he came out of, he took power just after Watergate. the shocks were happening in the American economy, which you talked about?
Carter got gobsmacked by the 70s and his presidency. He actually can be seen as a forerunner of neoliberalism. He ran on a campaign as a Democrat saying government had grown too large, that he was going to radically reduce the number of government agencies, that more sets of relationships and more activities had to be turned over to private markets. He had been a businessman, a small businessman, a peanut farmer, so he had experience with the market. He was also highly educated at the Naval Academy, trained as an engineer, so he knew his way around figures. But he was very inexperienced. Americans have a fondness for bringing inexperienced people into the highest office, have some crazy notion that people unsullied by the corrupting work of politics will do better than those who've been around politics a long time. Carter had been governor of Georgia for one term, but he had not been in politics very long. And he was just simply not prepared for the scale of challenges confronting him. And there were many. It was an economy that was simply not working, a very deep recession. None of his economic advisors had good answers for how to fix what was ailing the American economy. There were foreign policy challenges of a very severe nature: Soviet Union invading Afghanistan, the takeover of the Iranian Revolution, and the takeover of the American embassy in Tehran in 1979. So he tried to meet every challenge that he faced with good intentions and often some good thinking, but he did not have a clear enough and strong enough ideology to withstand the high winds that were blowing at him from different directions. He does take some significant deregulatory steps. He deregulates trucking, airlines. He makes a start toward deregulating the telecommunications industry. But rather than saying this is the way of the future and delivering that message with confidence, which is what Reagan would do as his successor, he would deregulate one day, and the next day he would invite the strong unions into the White House to discuss what might be done to enhance organized labor. And then he would switch from wanting to take down the New Deal order to listening to people who said it could still be restored. And so his signature is someone buffeted by the powerful cross currents of 1970s political economy and foreign policy. And you never had a feeling during Carter's administration that even though he was clearly a well-intentioned man and one of the more moral men to ever sit in the White House, he simply did not have control of the situation. And he was defeated badly by Reagan in 1980. And it was a sentiment expressed by overwhelming numbers of Americans that he was simply not equal to the task. So you could not give this man a second shot at the highest office in America. So well-intentioned, but not equal to the task. And to be fair, I don't know how many people would have been in the 1970s. It's if you're coming into office as a political order is coming apart, think of Joe Biden. What do you do? And how do you handle all the cross currents? And how do you master the situation so you can give it clear direction? You know, we see with Biden him experiencing another example, someone with well-intentioned, some good ideas. Actually, I think a clearer sense than Carter had of what he wants to do. But you see the furies that are unleashed when a political order is collapsing, and it's difficult for any individual to rise to the highest post in the land and to impose a new order upon it. And in that respect, Carter was not equal to the task.
I've been rereading a book about the famous speech he made in the late 70s, the malaise speech, the crisis of confidence speech, and the troubles that his staff had with that speech. But he always struck me in exactly the way you said. He was the first American president I think I took most notice of as I was entering my teenage years. Let's move on to Ronald Reagan. He was someone who believed in small government. He deregulated the media industry, the results of which are still with us today. He too benefited from the collapse of communism towards the end of his career. And he was the one, you say, who turned neoliberalism from being a political movement to actually a political order. That's right.
Yes. Well, I would say he got it close to being a political order. A political order doesn't fully triumph until the opposition party comes into office and must play by its terms. So the full triumph comes under Clinton. But you're right, Reagan has a sense that he has an ideology of neoliberalism that he wants to implant on American life. And he has the support of a vast network of organizations and intellectuals and jurists who have been thinking and waiting for this moment for years. This is the moment when, not Hayek himself, but a lot of people influenced by Hayek who've been in the wilderness, no shot at political power of any sort, suddenly have their chance. And networks of donors have been developing, and think tanks have been emerging. And Reagan also understands the challenge of building a political order. It's not just winning one election, and it's not just getting one bill passed. It's putting in a whole infrastructure of politics, machines that are good at winning election after election, think tanks that translate abstract economic principles developed in isolated mountaintops in Switzerland into practical policies that can work in a polity as complicated as the American one. He also understands that one has to go beyond simply bread and butter issues of deregulation. One has to change the courts to make sure that whatever neoliberal legislation passed by Congress is going to pass constitutional muster. So he's got a campaign to remake the court, to deliver a different kind of jurisprudence, which is going to support the neoliberal order. As you mentioned, he has plans for deregulating the media after a 50-year period, and this is part of the legacy of the New Deal order, when the media had been heavily regulated because of the feeling that media was a public utility, and as a public utility, it could not operate as your average corporation. It had an obligation to the public to deliver a public good, which is to make reasonable public debate possible in a democracy. Not a bad aspiration for a democracy to have. So the scope of his activity helps us to understand the sophistication of the enterprise, and we can see all the different elements of a political order taking shape during the Reagan years. And it's for anyone who wants to learn how to build a political order, I don't care whether you're on the left or right of the political spectrum, read that chapter in my book about what the Reaganites accomplished during the 1980s. You'll see the breadth of their ambition and the sophistication of their efforts to implant a new way of doing politics and implementing politics in America. And now he also took advantage of raw racial divisions in American life. The Reagan years were a time when a lot of the hope from the civil rights movement dissipated, and I remember those years intensely, and the memories are not good, but Black America and white America deeply divided from each other, often fighting literally in streets. Cities were not safe. And Reagan was searching for votes wherever he could get them. And he was eager for white votes in the South and the votes of disgruntled white ethnics in the North who they felt were being pushed out of their neighborhoods by African Americans, being given allegedly advantages that they had never enjoyed. So he plays the race card pretty ruthlessly. And so in that element of his politics is conservative. You know, he's saying white Americans can still find a way to stay on top. And I'll help you, meaning Reagan will help you keep blacks subordinate or limit their opportunities for advancement in American society. So there's a very ugly racial undertone to his politics. And also this is where the campaign for mass incarceration begins, of locking up America by the 1990s and first decade of the 21st century is going to have the largest incarcerated population of any nation in the world. And it's disproportionately minority, and the heaviest component of that is African American. This starts under him, and you might ask, you know, how can someone committed to free exchange, free movement of people, freeing the market from state regulation, undertake this vast state building enterprise of building prisons? I probe this issue in the book. It's a complicated one, and we can get into it if you want. But it needs to be said that as Reagan is creating the infrastructure for creating a vigorous market-free economy in the United States, free from government regulation, he is also taking quite a lot of steps to lock up a lot of people who, in a way, are deemed not fit for what the market offers. And so one way of thinking about mass incarceration is simply to remove these people from the opportunity to engage in market exchange. And that's one definition of what incarceration entails, right? You're in jail and you can no longer buy and sell or work for a wage in ways in which people on the outside can. And it's a very harsh and ugly way of ensuring that a market economy will operate freely. And I ponder the paradox of what does it mean for a discourse of freedom to depend so heavily on the unfreedom of a very significant part of the population.
And another aspect of that is often they're not able to vote after coming out of prison, aren't they?
Yes, and part of the story of incarceration in America is that it never really ends. You serve your time in jail, but there are all these votes, all these laws on the book saying that those who've been convicted of a felony will never be allowed to vote again. This is not a national law. This is handled on a state-by-state basis, but many states have this law. And also you're obligated to report your incarceration on any job you apply for. And that makes it very difficult that excludes a whole range of jobs from your future if you have that experience in your past. And so the damage done by incarceration is not just jail time. It's the inability of those who have done jail time to rehabilitate themselves and become fully functioning members and contributors to broader society, of which the market economy is a big part.
A lot of our work is about the future of cities, and I remember during this period how some US cities would compete against each other for the rights to open new jails because they were actually quite profitable ventures and offered employment and so on to people in the area.
Yes, the industry became so big that it was regarded as a form. Prison building and prison operation was considered in many states a form of economic development. And in New York State, for example, which had some of the largest prisons and prison populations, the prisons would not be located in major urban areas like New York City, where most of those arrested, where most of the arrests were occurring, and most of the arrests were of minority people. Most of the prisons were in rural upstate areas of New York, small towns, and entirely white. Attica was one, if you've heard of that prison. Yeah. Auburn was another, and these prisons expanded enormously. The guards were all from these local areas, and it was a very important source of employment. And so, yes, you're right. These prisons were sold as a form of, we might call, leveling up. for impoverished regions of New York State, and that in itself came to be a very ugly enterprise. And because of the rural white character of the guards and the urban black character of the prisoners, just made race relations within the prisons very raw and volatile and exploding in riots, some of them major riots, quite a lot of the time. Very, very difficult and ugly period in American life. And another irony is as the mass incarceration proceeds, this is the time when American urban areas like New York are getting safer, and many who are not part of these poor urban minority populations begin moving back into these cities. So here's another irony: the rejuvenation of America's cities in some ways is related to shipping off all kinds of New York City residents to far away rural places and locking them up for long periods of time. This is all part of the neoliberal order. And to understand, for example, the fury over George Floyd murder, the seeds for this were planted in the 1980s and 1990s, and they had been germinating and spreading their poison for 20 or 30 years by the time of George Floyd's murder. So this is a part of the story of the neoliberal order, and it's trying to understand how this rather ruthless story of locking people up can coexist with talk about freeing up markets and freeing up exchange and allowing individuals to go about their lives as they wished. This is one of the puzzles and paradoxes that I come back to again and again in the book, because it's not something easy to explain, but it's real, and that's why we have to pay close attention to it.
I just want to go through a couple of other presidents' work. Bill Clinton, you describe as America's neoliberal president par excellence. And I just want to ask you about two things there. The first was about financial deregulation, because he was the one who repealed parts of the Glass-Steagall Act, which was prominent later on in the financial crisis. And the second point is about how he didn't reverse the media fairness doctrine, which is what Reagan had abolished in his period in office. So there were two examples here, and I know there were many more with Clinton, but do you have anything more to add on? First of all, the media and the fairness doctrine, and secondly on financial deregulation.
Well, the fairness doctrine was a doctrine put in place in the 1940s as a way to regulate public political speech. And that would work as if you were a broadcaster and you had me on, but I'm not me, I'm Rush Limbaugh, a radio shock jockey who was one of the first conservative pit bulls who said anything he wanted to on air. During the period when the FAIR doctrine was in effect, if your radio station gave me, Rush Limbaugh, an hour of airtime to spew my thoughts into the ether, you were obligated to give equal time to someone who was opposed to Rush Limbaugh. And so that's the fairness doctrine, coming out of the sense that this was politics, and consumers needed to hear both sides before making up their minds about who was right. Removing the fairness doctrine meant removing that obligation to present the other side. And Rush Limbaugh always regarded the destruction of the fairness doctrine as his opportunity. And that's when he begins to run wild, millions of listeners on 3 hours a day, a very compelling shock jockey, as they were called in the United States, putting a premium on saying outrageous things and creating a bulldogish, take no prisoners approach to conservative politics, which made it a much more radical creed and combative creed than it had been prior to that time. The question is, why does Clinton not try and reverse it when he comes into office? There's really no serious talk. Some of his advisors wanted him to. I think to understand why not, we have to understand the techno-utopianism of the moment. The 90s was a decade of the internet's emergence. It had existed in parts before the 1990s, but it really makes its debut in the 1990s, and people begin to use the internet in ways they had not before. It's the moment when Google is born, and its forerunner was Netscape, which was founded in 1994. There are all these startups going on at the time, many of which are now the biggest corporations on the planet, all related to high tech. And just about everyone in politics was seduced by the possibilities of these technical advances. And to be fair, the technical advances involved with the internet and high tech in the 1990s probably represented as fundamental a transition in the history of communications as the invention of the book was 500 years earlier. So we're talking about a half a millennium event, right? Book publishing and the internet, that's all you get for a millennium, right? And America and the world was living through one of those events. And these events generate, understandably, utopianism about the way in which this is going to transform our world for the better. And part of the techno-utopian, the technical revolution was cable television. You no longer had 3 television stations, or you no longer were limited to, I don't know, 25 or 30 radio station on one frequency. You had thousands through satellite and cable. You had thousands of possibilities, and so the argument went, well, if you've got so many possibilities, what does it matter whether Rush Limbaugh has control of one station for 3 hours a day? There's so many others. The people who oppose him will have their own stations and will have their own 3 hours in the sun, and this can work. What was missing from that kind of calculation is capitalism, which is that you have all these enterprises, but anyone who studied the history of capitalism seriously knows there's always a period of growth, competition, followed by consolidation, and the emergence of winners and the emergence of losers. And so the question, which I think the Clintonites did not take seriously in the 1990s, is would liberals and the left end up on the losing side of this free-for-all and mass communications? And I think with the enormous success of Fox News, which debuted in 1994 and 1995, I think we can say on balance the Democrats have been the losers of that struggle. But they didn't think in the 1990s that they would be at the time. And they were informed by this techno-utopianism, thinking that the tools that the scientists had handled politicians were so amazing, it was going to transform politics in beneficial ways. And so hands off. Let the market deliver. It also mattered that Clinton, after his election in 1992, lost both houses of Congress in 1994, the worst defeat for a sitting Democratic president since Harry Truman had lost both houses of Congress in 1946. So he's chastened by that. And it also matters that the Soviet Union had not simply collapsed, but taken itself apart and disappeared from world politics. And America's and capitalism's most ardent opponent in the world is suddenly gone, and there's a triumphalism that infects all aspects of American politics, Democrat as well as Republican. America has triumphed. Its way is a triumphant way. In part, the Soviet Union collapsed because they could not take advantage of these IT innovations and still have as controlled a society as they wanted for themselves. And so there was a sense of American triumph, and let one of the ingredients of American triumph, markets, let them do their thing. And it defeated the Soviet Union. If the Soviet Union could not withstand this onslaught, well, then who the hell could? It was a moment of hubris. And one other element as well, the amount of data, the ability to crunch data that the new computing techniques and machines put within the hands of economists and others allowed a lot of people to think that the greatest danger of markets, which was risk, people taking risks they shouldn't have, could be eliminated, because now the data that we had in our hands was so perfect that risk could be eliminated or it could be managed or snuffed out the moment it reared its head. And so everyone got on the bandwagon, and it is certainly ironic that it is a Democratic president rather than a Republican one who puts the finishing touches on the neoliberal order. And what Clinton did in terms of deregulating Wall Street, as you mentioned, making it impossible to regulate derivatives, the hot new commodity on markets, turning all of North America into a single common market on the model of the EU, deregulating telecommunications so that the government simply abandoned its role of regarding private media utilities as a public good that had to be managed in the public interest. All this went away under the two administrations of Bill Clinton, which inclines me to make the judgment that Clinton may have done more than Reagan to facilitate neoliberal order's triumph.
So what followed Clinton was George W. Bush, and particularly there the Iraq fiasco, and then Barack Obama came in the financial crisis. By this stage, there were many questions being asked about neoliberalism. Capitalism was failing a lot of people. You had the growth of the protest movements like Occupy Wall Street. You had beginnings of Black Lives Matter. You also had the Tea Party protests happening as well. So you began to see here this failure of a model and the growth of opposition as coming together. We don't have time, sadly, but in your book you include some very interesting research from someone quite controversial, Charles Murray, about what the impact of some of this was on a small town in northern Philadelphia, I think it is. Fishtown, yes. And you've got the growth of the precariat and the gig economy, and incarceration continues. Plus, you had things like the beginnings of the research into the deaths of despair that Anne Case and Angus Deaton write about in their book. Bring it on to now. You then had Trump arrival and winning the presidential election. You had the Bernie Sanders insurgency. You had Hillary Clinton's failure to win. Trump was the end. Is Trump the end of neoliberalism? Is Trump the end of neoliberalism, do you think?
I think I would say Trump is not the end of neoliberalism, but Trump marks the end of the neoliberal order. I think elements of neoliberalism will survive for quite some time. And I would add to Trump's emergence on the political stage in America, that of Bernie Sanders. It was inconceivable in the heyday of the neoliberal order, the 1990s, that a socialist senator from the tiny state of Vermont and a real estate mogul in New York City, widely ridiculed and popular, immensely wealthy, but no one took him too seriously, that these two would be the most important and dynamic players in America's 2016 presidential election. That was unimaginable in the 1990s. And to me, that signified the breakup of a fracture, or at least the fracturing of the neoliberal order. What defines an order is the ability of an order and its ideology to compel all significant political players to abide by its terms. That's one reason why Clinton played along with the free market ideology of the 1990s. By 2016, Trump and Sanders, they have no use for, neither has any use for free markets. They're both committed to protectionism. They are talking about the little guy who's been left behind. They're talking about that a war fought in the name of neoliberalism by George W. Bush had been a catastrophe, something you couldn't have said in American politics and survive in either party 15 years earlier. So for me, this marks the loss of the neoliberal order's authority and ability to command. And suddenly you have movements on the right and the left able to make their voices heard in ways that they had been not heard for 20 or 30 years prior to that time. And I read that in terms of, I interpret that in terms of a political order coming apart. As to what will come next, don't really know. The collapse of an order is a very volatile, uncertain time. And I think if viewers outside the United States viewing the United States today and trying to figure out what the hell is going on in the United States, that's a sign of a political order collapsing. A tremendous amount of volatility, anger. It's hard for one party or the other to really stamp itself and its politics on the country as a whole. We can see two political orders in formation. One is an authoritarian order that is associated with Trump or some of the Trumpinistas that he had spawned, as ethno-nationalist, America first, isolating America from the world, returning to forms of white supremacy, or at least privileging whites over non-whites in the American population, and also a willingness to, I think, betray the principles of American democracy for the sake of achieving and holding power. Trump, the strong man, that's a familiar figure in Europe at a time when democracies have trouble doing their work, frustration with parliaments. They compromise, they can't make decisions. Give us a strong man who's got to embody and articulate and implant the will of the people. Europe has had plenty of experience with this. America has not, but Trump represents a kind of throwback to that era. We know what that order would look like if it succeeds in establishing itself. On the other side, you have a Democratic Party trying to step out of the Clinton-Obama years and step away from neoliberalism. And Bernie Sanders has led a rebirth of the left in American politics and has made that left stronger than it has been since at any time since the 1930s and 40s. And historically, the Democrats have been strongest in America and most influential when the center and the left of the Democratic Party are in productive discussions, productive policy discussions with each other. And that is certainly the story of the first year of the Biden administration. Biden turning to the left in ways in which Obama and Clinton never did, to become part of the coalition, to become part of the design of legislation, to incorporate left ambitions into the Democratic Party's agenda while tempering them at the same time. Things look very good for the first 6 months of the Biden administration in that way, and then the next 6 months look very, very bad. And the question is whether August and the recent string of successes that Biden has had will reignite some of the optimism of that first 6 months. But the part of what has made the grasp and achievement of the Democrats so uncertain is that they have the smallest majority imaginable in the Senate, and it's hard to be a transformative party and president with such a slender amount of support. And so it's hard for them to lock down their achievements, and we don't know what's going to happen in 2022. The predictions have been for Democratic wipeout in the House and the Senate. That may now be changing. But even if the Democrats lose, I would urge them to take a page from Hayek and Mount Pelerin regarding the long march and understand how long the march to a political order can be. So we can see a progressive political order in outline. I think it's weak. Its formation is currently weaker than the authoritarian political order that has developed on the right. But it's impossible at this point to predict which is going to triumph. And the United States may be also in a period of extended political disorder, where neither of those formations is able to become a political order, able to enforce its will on American society. And even if many Americans prefer disorder to a Trump authoritarian order, living amidst political disorder is not a good place to be.
Just two quick final points. The first is about one of the issues to address in challenging neoliberalism, I guess, is the role of government. And do you think the way the pandemic was managed in the end has seen people see the value of strong government action on things?
I now think that it had less of an impact than I thought at the time. I thought, oh my goodness, government is deploying its power. It's going to be legitimate again. This is a good thing. But I think the many people who supported that deployment of government power on both sides of the partisan divide in America regarded government deployment of that power as legitimate because it was such an exceptional and extraordinary event. And if we look at the difficulty the Democrats have had in transforming that exercise of power for an emergency, a health emergency, into regular politics, the difficulty they've had in making that transition, the loss entirely of the Republican support that had been there for these emergency measures. The assault on government in America has gone on for so long and so deeply. I think it's reasonable to think that attitudes of skepticism and anger toward government are not going to reverse in a day. And I think the much more important act encouraging pro-government sentiment is the climate legislation that Congress will now be passing, and which will be regarded as the most significant achievement of Biden's first 2 years. And it does represent the biggest commitment to containing climate change ever passed by a Congress in the United States of America. So it's a very significant moment. But living through the coming out of the pandemic and the eagerness of many players in American society to restore life as to what it was before the pandemic has made me realize the pandemic by itself cannot change fundamentally American attitudes toward government, that has to happen through some other means. And that is going to take a lot longer to achieve. And that's where the long march comes in. That's going to take a lot longer to achieve than the willingness to meet a true health, life and death emergency.
And just finally on that point, I mean, I was much encouraged by the climate legislation going through, and we've done a lot of work around things like the Green New Deal and the work that took place for that. And I think of some of the people that Biden has got involved as advisors who we've had speak, and we've read their works, people like Stephanie Kelton and Heather Boushey, who you talk about in your book. It does seem that there's it's crude to say an evidence base, but certainly a case is being made for different thinking in these areas. But as you say, you've got to bring together not just the case and the arguments, but also the coalition of support, which is very hard, I think. We see that here in terms of elections in the United Kingdom and similarly in the United States.
Yes, the opening that Sanders created in 2016 with his run to the presidency on an explicitly leftist basis opened up all kinds of space for thinkers to get their views heard for a much larger audience than had been the case before. And Stephanie Kelton, the economist, Heather Boushey, an economist, Lina Khan from Columbia Law School, who wants to reinvigorate an older tradition of what is called antitrust in America, which is breaking up corporations that get too big and wield too much power. There are many, Tim Wu, also from Columbia Law School. I think my message to them, because I'm sure the last 6 months has been incredibly frustrating for them, defeat after defeat. And I think it's important that the left in the House of Representatives has signaled that it is aboard this package. It's not gonna hold out for something more, which is a good sign. They understand the importance of cashing in on this victory. But the idea components and the institutions established and the networks of people talking to each other and their entry points into this administration so that they can talk with real politicians who have real constituencies. My message to them is that they have to steady themselves for the long march, and they have to be ready to anticipate defeat and then overcome defeat. When Roosevelt came into office in 1933 and unveils his New Deal, his administration was full of people who had been banging their heads against opposition that they could not move for 10 or 15 or 20 years. And if we want to understand the significance of the New Deal and the New Deal order, we have to understand that a whole brains trust was built up between, say, 1910 and 1930. Very little visible in politics because they had very little political access. They had some in a state here and there, New York, Wisconsin, to a certain extent, California. But mostly they were in the political wilderness, and yet they stuck to their guns, they stuck to their ideas, they refined them, they continue to make connections, they continue to network. And then amidst the Great Depression of the 1930s, they got their opportunity. The same thing with the neoliberals descending with their 10 commandments from Mount Pelerin in 1947. They spent 25 years in the wilderness before really getting a crack at political power. And so I think there's an optimistic story, and some people reading my book have been taking it in this vein. I think you read the end of my book, it's not a moment of optimism, but if you think of the book as a whole, you can see that these two political orders depended on ideas that intellectuals and policymakers developed over a 20-year period with great confidence, with great commitment, steeling themselves against the many defeats they suffered. And the message of the book in terms of building political orders is that they did get their day in the sun, and they did become critical architects of profound political and influential formations in American life. And so I think it's very important for the progressives and left today, who are really getting their first taste of political power in the Biden administration and in the staffs of certain senators and congressmen, to understand this process and how long it takes. America is a big place. And politics is very localized. And to command the political stage requires a comprehensive strategy of gaining votes, building support, and not losing heart, even as one is suffering repeated defeats. And so my message in a way is that the idea is that these policymakers who are part of the progressive phalanx today matter in a very important way. And they just need to stay the course and come up with the Herculean patience. That's not a good phrase, Herculean patience. We have to stick some other person in there. The patience required and the belief and conviction that their ideas at some point will enjoy success. It just takes time and effort and reversals to build political orders in a country as large and as diverse as the United States of America.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, America and the World in the Free Market Era, is out now. It is an instant classic, as the Financial Times said. Thank you very much, Gary, for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.